Top 1. The Coccolizly Epidemic. The Coccolizly epidemic began when the Spanish believed they had already secured their victory. They had conquered Mexico using steel and smallpox. The ancient temples were reduced to rubble. The emperor was dead, and the survivors were forced to labor in fields and mines under a sky that remained unchanged. Then in the summer of 1545, something unprecedented arrived, something the conquerors had never witnessed and even their priests could not name. Within 3 years, it claimed more lives than any plague in recorded history, surpassing even the Black Death and the Justinianic plague. This is the epidemic you have likely never heard of. For nearly 5 centuries, the pathogen behind the Coccolizly epidemic remained nameless. Franciscan friars meticulously recorded the symptoms in great detail, while Spanish physicians documented the dying in clinical reports sent back to Madrid. Indigenous scribes painted the dead in pictorial manuscripts that somehow survived. Yet the cause remained a biological ghost, something that passed through the world leaving only bones and descriptions behind. In 2018, a team at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, led by geneticist Johannes Krause, extracted ancient DNA from the teeth of victims buried in a mass grave at Tepozcalula, Yucunda, in Oaxaca. The results, published in Nature Ecology and Evolution, identified the bacterium as Salmonella enterica serovar, paratyphi C, a cause of enteric fever that modern medicine treats with a standard course of antibiotics. A bacterium that modern medicine treats routinely killed an estimated 5 to 15 million people in just 3 years. The massive gap between what Salmonella paratyphi C is capable of today and what it apparently did then is the impossibility at the center of the Coccolizly mystery. The friar Juan de Torquemada recorded the symptoms he witnessed in 1545: great fever, black tongue, dark urine, neurological convulsions, and bleeding from the eyes, nose, and mouth. This clinical picture matched no known European epidemic of that period. The 2018 Max Planck study recovered Salmonella paratyphi C DNA from 17 of 24 skeletal samples taken from the Oaxacan mass grave, a recovery rate high enough to confirm a widespread systemic infection. Spanish colonial census records document a population of approximately 25 million indigenous Mexicans in 1518. By 1600, that number had fallen to approximately 1 million, a collapse of 96% over 80 years. The Coccolizly is identified as the sharpest single phase of that decline. The drought of the 1540s, confirmed by tree ring data as the worst in 500 years in the region, had already created conditions of severe malnutrition and immune collapse in the surviving population before the first case appeared. Francisco Hernandez, the royal physician of Philip II of Spain, documented the epidemic in clinical detail and noted that Spanish colonists living in the same drought conditions were largely spared, suggesting a population-specific vulnerability rather than a universal pathogen response. A second wave struck in 1576, killing an additional 2 million people, confirming the epidemic was not a single catastrophic event, but a recurring biological cycle. The word Coccolizly itself is Nahuatl for pestilence. The indigenous population had no specific name for this disease because nothing like it had existed in their world before 1545. Historians and epidemiologists broadly accept that the Coccolizly was an enteric fever outbreak amplified catastrophically by the specific vulnerabilities of a population already devastated by smallpox, measles, and the physical and psychological trauma of conquest and displacement. The drought contaminated water supplies and created nutritional collapse that favored Salmonella paratyphi C transmission through fecal-oral routes. Spanish colonists were spared in this model because European populations had centuries of exposure to enteric pathogens and had developed partial immunity. However, enteric fever, even in its most severe untreated modern presentations, does not produce bleeding from the eyes and nose. Francisco Hernandez was the royal physician of the Spanish crown, trained in the most advanced European medical tradition of the 16th century. He was not writing in metaphor, he was documenting hemorrhage, and Salmonella paratyphi C does not cause hemorrhage. Some researchers have proposed the Coccolizly may have involved a viral hemorrhagic co-infection, something resembling a hantavirus or an ancestral arenavirus, emerging from rodent reservoirs driven into human settlements by the drought. According to this line of thinking, the Salmonella DNA recovered by the Max Planck team may represent a co-pathogen rather than the primary cause, with the hemorrhagic agent leaving no recoverable genetic material after 5 centuries of soil exposure. If that is the case, could the true killer still be circulating in the rodent populations of central Mexico? Could it be waiting for the conditions, drought, malnutrition, and concentrated human settlements that allow it to spill over again? We may never know, but the hemorrhage in those friars' reports has never been explained away, and that is the detail that keeps this mystery open. Top 2. The Plague of Athens. From a killer with no name, we cross the Atlantic to an epidemic that had a chronicler, a burial pit, and 2,000 years of scholarly argument, yet still cannot be identified: the Plague of Athens. Athens was the most powerful democracy on earth. It had defeated the Persian Empire at Marathon and built the Parthenon. Its navy controlled the Aegean. Then a ship docked at the port of Piraeus. Within 2 years, the man who had designed Athenian democracy was dead. A quarter of the city's population was in mass graves. The epidemic's chronicler, a trained observer who survived it and described it in clinical detail, has left us a mystery that 2,450 years of medicine have still not solved. Thucydides survived the plague and wrote about it in his History of the Peloponnesian War with the methodical precision of a military historian. He listed symptoms in order of progression, noted the disease's geographic origin in sub-Saharan Africa, and described its behavioral effects on the Athenian population with a detachment that reads more like an autopsy report than a narrative. His account became the first known epidemiological document in Western literature. In 1994 and 1995, during construction of the Athens Metro at the Kerameikos district, workers uncovered a mass burial pit containing nearly 150 bodies consistent with emergency epidemic burial. In 2006, a team led by Manolis Papagrigorakis at the University of Athens extracted DNA from the dental pulp of the Kerameikos victims and published findings in the International Journal of Infectious Diseases, proposing typhoid fever as the cause. Yet the most precisely described epidemic in ancient history still cannot be matched to any known disease. At least a dozen pathogens have been proposed with serious academic backing: typhoid, typhus, smallpox, measles, Ebola, toxic shock syndrome, and combinations thereof. Every candidate fits some symptoms and fails on others. The plague of Athens either killed with a pathogen that no longer exists in its 430 BC form, or it killed with a combination so specific to that moment that medicine has never seen it replicated. Thucydides described the progression with clinical precision: violent heat in the head, redness and inflammation of the eyes, bleeding from the throat and tongue, sneezing and hoarseness, chest pain, vomiting, an external pustular rash, and an overwhelming internal burning that drove victims to throw themselves into wells seeking water. The mortality rate within Athens reached an estimated 25 to 33% of the total population, approximately 100,000 deaths in 4 years. Pericles, the architect of Athenian democracy, died in the epidemic's second year, 429 BC, a political decapitation from which Athens never fully recovered. The 2006 Papagrigorakis study recovered Salmonella typhi DNA sequences from 3 of 5 dental samples from the Kerameikos pit, supporting a typhoid diagnosis. Thucydides recorded that the disease originated in Ethiopia before passing through Egypt and Libya to reach Athens via maritime trade routes, suggesting a tropical origin. And then there is the detail that stops every proposed diagnosis in its tracks: birds and scavenging animals that fed on the corpses also died. This is a detail that implies zoonotic virulence extending well beyond the known host range of typhoid fever. Most contemporary epidemiologists favor typhoid or a typhoid-like illness as the most compatible diagnosis, supported by the 2006 DNA evidence. The overcrowding of Athenian citizens behind the long walls during the Spartan siege created ideal conditions for waterborne transmission, and the city's concentrated, immunologically diverse population explains the catastrophic spread. The sub-Saharan origin is consistent with typhoid strains that were endemic to North Africa and the Nile corridor, But typhoid fever does not kill the birds and scavenging animals that eat human corpses. Thucydides was not a poet. His account is deliberately stripped of metaphor. That single detail about animal mortality either describes a real biological phenomenon or Thucydides inserted an unexplained anomaly into the most precise medical document of the ancient world for no reason anyone has ever been able to supply. Some researchers have proposed the plague of Athens was not a single disease, but a cascading multi-pathogen event. Multiple infections hitting a malnourished, overcrowded population simultaneously, producing a clinical picture that no individual pathogen can replicate. The sub-Saharan origin Thucydides describes might, according to some interpretations, point toward a hemorrhagic fever that mutated during its transit along North African trade routes. Could this be the portrait of a disease that burned itself out in the same catastrophe it caused? An ancient pathogen that simply no longer exists? Supposedly, science has answered this question, but the answer keeps changing, and the birds keep dying in Thucydides' account, unexplained after more than 2 millennia. Top 3. The Antonine Plague. Athens fell in 4 years. What the next epidemic did to Rome took longer, but the scale was vaster, the documentation more precise, and the political consequences have never fully ended. The Antonine Plague. The Roman legions marched home from the Parthian War as conquerors. They had sacked Seleucia, the great city on the Tigris. They had looted its temples, broken its walls, and driven its people into the desert. They came home with gold, silk, slaves, and something else, something they could not see, something that traveled in their breath. Within 3 years, it was killing 5,000 people a day in the city of Rome. Galen of Pergamon, the greatest physician of the ancient world, witnessed the epidemic firsthand and wrote extensive clinical descriptions across multiple texts, earning the epidemic its alternate name, the Galenic Plague. He described the symptoms with the systematic precision of a man who understood he was watching something historically unprecedented. Modern scholarly synthesis of the epidemic's full demographic and political impact was substantially advanced by historian Kyle Harper in his 2017 work, The Fate of Rome, which drew on papyri, inscriptions, military records, and coin debasement data from across the empire to build the most complete demographic picture of the catastrophe yet assembled. Galen's description of the symptoms, a full-body pustular rash, black diarrhea, throat inflammation, and sustained high fever, matches smallpox with a precision that contemporary epidemiologists find difficult to dismiss. But if this was smallpox in 165 AD, official history places the confirmed arrival of smallpox in the Mediterranean disease landscape considerably later. Something crossed the eastern frontier with those soldiers that had never existed in Rome's world before. And once it arrived, it set in motion a chain of consequences that did not fully resolve until the empire itself had ceased to exist. Galen's surviving texts describe the epidemic symptoms across multiple clinical accounts: a full-body pustular rash, black diarrhea indicating internal bleeding, throat inflammation, and sustained high fever. This presentation is now recognized by epidemiologists as most consistent with smallpox, or possibly measles. The epidemic killed an estimated 5 million people across the Roman Empire, including Emperor Lucius Verus in 169 AD, the co-emperor of Marcus Aurelius, and his partner in the Parthian campaign that introduced the pathogen. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the epidemic in his Meditations, recording the psychological experience of governing an empire during mass death, one of the only first-hand accounts of pandemic governance from the ancient world. Kyle Harper's analysis of Egyptian papyri and Roman census records suggests some provinces lost up to 1/3 of their population. The legions suffered such catastrophic manpower losses that Marcus Aurelius was forced to recruit gladiators and Germanic tribal warriors to maintain frontier defense. Harper argues this military depletion directly enabled the first serious, sustained barbarian incursions across the Rhine-Danube frontier, making the epidemic causally responsible for the beginning of Rome's permanent defensive crisis. Silver content in Roman coins dropped from 90% to 75% under Marcus Aurelius, a direct fiscal response to the manpower and economic losses, representing the earliest measurable phase of Roman monetary debasement. Chinese historical sources record a nearly identical epidemic, striking the Han Dynasty in 161 and 162 AD, the same years as the Roman outbreak, suggesting a single pathogen traveling along the Silk Road in both directions simultaneously. Historians broadly accept that the Antonine Plague was most likely smallpox introduced to an immunologically naive Mediterranean population by soldiers who had campaigned in the Near East where the disease was already endemic. The demographic collapse it triggered contributed to the long-term weakening of Roman imperial capacity, accelerating a decline that already had structural, economic, and political dimensions. But if this was smallpox, the question is not just what it was. It is where it came from and why it appeared at this precise moment. Galen's description is precise enough that modern epidemiologists are largely confident in the diagnosis. Yet no earlier Roman source describes this disease in the Mediterranean world. Something entirely new crossed that eastern frontier. The simultaneous appearance of an identical epidemic at the other end of the Silk Road suggests that what Rome experienced was not an isolated introduction, but one front of a connected civilizational scale event. Some researchers have proposed the Antonine Plague represents the first introduction of a fully evolved smallpox virus into a completely immunologically naive Eurasian population, a civilizational immune catastrophe with no Western parallel until 1492 in the Americas. The Silk Road that had enriched both Rome and the Han Dynasty had, according to this line of thinking, quietly built a pathogen highway connecting the world's two superpowers. Could the fall of Rome and the fragmentation of the Han Dynasty, happening simultaneously and separated by 6,000 kilometers, be two expressions of the same biological catastrophe? And if so, what else might be moving along modern global trade networks that we have not yet identified? Top 4. The plague of Cyprian Rome survived the Antonine Plague. 80 years later, something worse arrived, and this time, the symptoms were so strange that even Galen's successors had no framework for what they were seeing: the plague of Cyprian. The bishop of Carthage watched his congregation die and sat down to write a sermon about it. Not a lament, but a theological argument. The plague, Cyprian wrote, was a gift. It separated the faithful from the fearful and revealed who truly believed in the life beyond this one. His name would be given to the disease that was killing 5,000 people a day in Rome alone. What that disease actually was, more than 17 centuries later, we still cannot say with certainty. Cyprian's sermon, De Mortalitate, written around 252 AD, survives and contains the most detailed symptom description of the epidemic from any contemporary source. Then in 2013, an Italian archaeological mission associated with the University of Salento and led by Egyptologist Paola Davoli, working at Luxor at the site of ancient Lycopolis, discovered a mass burial site containing bodies covered in thick layers of quicklime, a disinfection practice, alongside a kiln for burning burial materials and a structure interpreted as a communal epidemic response facility. The site was radiocarbon dated to the Cyprianic period, making it the first physical archaeological evidence of an organized institutional response to this specific epidemic ever found. The plague of Cyprian killed at a rate that exceeds any documented ancient epidemic mortality figure, 5,000 deaths per day in Rome, alone at its peak. According to ancient sources, it lasted 13 years, and its symptom profile, profuse, uncontrollable diarrhea, projectile vomiting, hemorrhage from the eyes, gangrene consuming the extremities of living patients, and what appears to be severe internal bleeding, does not match any single classified ancient disease. Whatever it was, it behaved in ways that still have no documented parallel in the history of epidemic medicine. Cyprian's De Mortalitate describes the progression with extraordinary specificity: vomiting that could not be stopped, dysentery that exhausted bodily strength within days, fever burning in the veins, hands and feet developing gangrene that caused them to fall away from the body while the patient was still alive, and eyes producing an unstoppable discharge of blood. The epidemic lasted from 249 to 262 AD, 13 years, making it the longest-running epidemic in Roman history. Emperor Hostilian died of the plague in 251 AD, and so many emperors, co-emperors, and military commanders perished during what historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century. Kyle Harper, in The Fate of Rome, argues the plague itself may have caused the political fragmentation rather than merely coinciding with it. The 2013 Luxor discovery included bodies covered in quicklime, burned burial implements, and a purpose-built communal disinfection structure, the only physical archaeological evidence yet recovered of an organized response to this epidemic. Egyptian papyri from the period record entire villages appearing as completely depopulated on tax rolls with 0 living inhabitants across multiple provincial districts of North Africa. The historian Zosimus wrote that the plague depopulated entire provinces, leaving fields untilled and cities without functioning governments. Harper's demographic analysis suggests the plague of Cyprian may have reduced the Roman Empire's total population by as much as 1/3 between 249 and 270 AD, a demographic loss exceeding even the Antonine plague that preceded it. Most historians classify the plague of Cyprian as likely a filovirus, possibly an ancestral relative of Ebola, or alternatively as a pandemic of severe hemorrhagic influenza. The 13-year duration and the wave pattern suggest it was not a single introduction event, but a recurring cycle of infection through a population with no prior immunity. The political chaos of the crisis of the 3rd century both amplified the epidemic's impact and was amplified by it. But Ebola burns fast. The largest Ebola outbreak in recorded history, the 2014 to 2016 West African epidemic, killed approximately 11,000 people across 18 months before exhausting its susceptible population and collapsing. The plague of Cyprian allegedly killed 5,000 people per day in a single city and then traveled across the entire Mediterranean world for 13 years without burning out. Whatever it was, it did not behave like Ebola. It did not behave like anything we have a classification for. Some biologists have proposed the plague of Cyprian represents the first recorded emergence of a genuinely novel pathogen from an animal reservoir, possibly bats or rodents in North Africa, that had enough genetic novelty to devastate an immunologically unprepared population while simultaneously evolving toward lower virulence over its 13-year course. If this pathogen emerged from a wild animal reservoir, that reservoir still exists somewhere. The ecological conditions that produced the first spillover event in 249 AD, urbanization, climate instability, and concentrated human populations near wildlife habitat, have not disappeared. We may never know what Cyprian was actually watching die, but the question of where it went and whether anything like it still waits in some animal population we have not yet surveyed is not an ancient question. It is a current one. Top 5. The Justinianic Plague. 3 centuries after Cyprian, the same Mediterranean world would face its first confirmed bubonic plague pandemic. This time we have the DNA. What we do not have is an explanation for why the strain that caused it then went completely extinct, the Justinianic Plague. In the summer of 541 AD, something arrived in the Egyptian port of Pelusium. It came on a grain ship traveling in the fleas that lived on the rats that ate the grain in the holds. Within 4 months, it had reached Constantinople. Within a year, Emperor Justinian himself was dying. His doctors were helpless, and the eyewitness historian Procopius was standing in the streets of the capital, watching 10,000 people a day disappear into mass graves. The first bubonic plague pandemic had begun. When it finally ended 2 centuries later, the specific genetic strain that caused it had ceased to exist, vanished from the earth as completely as the empire it had helped to destroy. Procopius of Caesarea witnessed the Constantinople outbreak firsthand and described it in History of the Wars with clinical and sociological detail that remains one of the most vivid epidemic accounts from the ancient world. In 2013, a landmark study led by David Wagner and colleagues, published in The Lancet Infectious Diseases, confirmed the causative agent as Yersinia pestis through ancient DNA extracted from 6th century skeletal remains at the Aschheim burial site in Bavaria. A subsequent 2016 study by the Panga Ancient DNA Consortium, published in Molecular Biology and Evolution, traced the strain's phylogenetic origin to Central Asia. In 2019, a study led by Marcel Keller and colleagues, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, recovered ancient DNA from 17 Justinianic plague victims across 5 European countries and confirmed that all belonged to a single genetic lineage, one that the study explicitly identifies as subsequently extinct. Yersinia pestis did not go extinct. It returned in 1347 as the Black Death. The species survived, and the ancestral Central Asian reservoir survived. Only this specific variant, the one that had already demonstrated it could kill tens of millions across 2 centuries of recurring pandemic waves, vanished. That gap, a successful pandemic strain disappearing while the species that produced it persisted, is the biological mystery at the heart of the Justinianic plague. Procopius described 10,000 deaths per day in Constantinople at the epidemic's peak, a figure that modern demographers consider plausible given the city's estimated population of 500,000 and the density of grain-driven rat populations concentrated in the harbor district. Emperor Justinian contracted the plague himself in 542 AD and survived, an outcome Procopius found theologically and politically bewildering, having already prepared himself to report the emperor's death. The 2013 Wagner study genetically confirmed the cause and demonstrated the bacterium had already developed its characteristic pneumonic transmission capability. Historian John of Ephesus, a contemporary witness, described ships loaded with corpses drifting at sea with no living crew, mass burial pits outside Constantinople's walls, abandoned when gravediggers died faster than replacements could be recruited, and entire provincial agricultural systems collapsing because every farmer was dead. The epidemic's economic devastation fatally undermined Justinian's ongoing reconquest of Italy and North Africa. The campaign meant to restore the unified Roman Empire, which died not on the battlefield, but in the port districts of the empire's grain-importing cities. A 2018 study by Michael McCormick and colleagues at Harvard, published in Antiquity, connected the plague's arrival to the climate disruption of 536 AD, a volcanic winter caused by a massive eruption that created crop failures across the northern hemisphere and produced the malnourished, immunologically compromised population that the plague then swept through. Historians and geneticists broadly agree the Justinianic plague represents the first pandemic phase of Yersinia pestis, a bacterium that had recently evolved in its Central Asian rodent reservoir. Its extinction as a lineage is attributed to the evolutionary dead end of extreme virulence. A pathogen that kills its hosts too efficiently exhausts susceptible populations and cannot maintain the transmission chains required for geographic persistence. But Yersinia pestis survived in that same Central Asian reservoir and produced the Black Death 600 years later. The species did not die, only this variant did. What selects against a successful pandemic strain while preserving the ancestral population that spawned it? And why did 600 years elapse between the first and second pandemics with no documented recurrence? Some researchers have proposed the Justinianic plague ended not because the pathogen died, but because the surviving human population had acquired sufficient immune memory to interrupt transmission, effectively the first documented example of population-level immune adaptation through catastrophic mortality. According to this model, the 600-year gap represents the precise generational span required for that immune memory to fade entirely. Immune memory, unlike genetic memory, does not pass to descendants. Could the rhythm of bubonic plague pandemics reflect the human immune system's forgetting cycle? We may never know, but the 600-year gap is precise enough to make the question deeply uncomfortable. Top 6. The Bronze Age collapse epidemic. From a known pathogen whose variant vanished, we travel back 12 centuries to a moment when disease may have helped end not one civilization, but 5 simultaneously across 2,000 kilometers of the ancient world's most connected region, the Bronze Age collapse epidemic. Within 50 years, every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean ceased to exist. The Mycenaeans, who had built the walls of Tiryns from stone so massive that later Greeks thought giants had placed them, vanished. The Hittite Empire, which had fought Egypt to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh and carved its peace treaties into the walls of the Temple of Karnak, collapsed overnight. The city of Ugarit, the greatest trading port of the ancient world, burned and was never rebuilt. Someone pressed a clay tablet in the city's final hours and left a message describing a great death and cities being consumed. It was never delivered. The Bronze Age collapse has been studied for over a century, but the role of epidemic disease gained specific scholarly traction through Brandon Drake's 2012 climatic study in the Journal of Archaeological Science and Eric Klein's 2014 synthesis. 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. The discovery and translation of the Ugarit tablets, clay letters baked accidentally in the fires that destroyed the city, provided the first written evidence of simultaneous multi-front crises, including what one tablet describes as a great death spreading through cities. Hittite royal archives at Hadassa contain references to an epidemic arriving from Egyptian prisoners of war, documented in the prayer texts of King Mursili II. The simultaneous collapse of multiple interconnected civilizations across a zone spanning 2,000 kilometers cannot be explained by any single cause. But when drought, invasion, agricultural failure, and political fragmentation are all accounted for, something still does not add up about the speed. Drought is slow, invasions are regional. The Mycenaean, Hittite, Ugaritic, and Levantine civilizations all failed within a single human lifetime. The tablet describing a great death was written at precisely the same historical moment all the other catastrophes peaked. Disease may not have been the cause of the Bronze Age collapse, but it may have been the accelerant that turned manageable stress into total extinction. A clay tablet found at Ugarit, translated by scholars at the Louvre, reads in part that death has come up into the streets, written in the final years before the city's destruction around 1185 BC. Hittite King Mursili II's prayer texts describe a plague that killed his father, Suppiluliuma I, and devastated the Hittite royal court, explicitly saying the disease arrived with Egyptian prisoners of war, demonstrating that the diplomatic networks connecting these civilizations were active pathogen corridors. Hattusa itself was abandoned without evidence of conquest. No mass battle casualties, no extensive burning in most areas, suggesting a population that ceased to exist rather than one that was defeated. Brandon Drake's 2012 study confirmed a severe multi-decade drought beginning around 1200 BC that simultaneously failed harvests across the entire eastern Mediterranean, creating the nutritional vulnerability that epidemic disease would have exploited. Skeletal analysis of Bronze Age collapsed populations in the Levant shows stress markers consistent with malnutrition and infectious disease in the generations immediately preceding the final collapse. Linear B tablets from Mycenaean sites record increasingly desperate ration distributions and emergency military mobilizations. The administrative record of a civilization trying and failing to manage simultaneous crises. Eric Klein's 2014 analysis identifies the Sea Peoples, the mysterious migrating warriors depicted on Egyptian temple reliefs, as likely climate and plague refugees from the collapsing Mycenaean and Anatolian cultures. Most archaeologists favor a multi-causal systems collapse model in which drought, invasion, internal rebellion, and disrupted trade networks all compounded simultaneously. Disease is included as a contributing stress factor, but is rarely assigned causal primacy because direct pathogen evidence from 1200 BC skeletal material is extremely difficult to recover. But the Hittite prayer texts are not archaeological inference. They are first-hand written records explicitly identifying an epidemic arriving through a documented transmission route and killing named rulers. Some researchers have proposed the Bronze Age collapse represents the ancient world's most complete documented example of epidemic disease as a civilizational force multiplier. Could the very infrastructure that made these civilizations great, the grain ships, the diplomatic missions, the prisoner exchanges, have been the precise mechanism through which a pathogen traveled fast enough to outrun every civilization's capacity to respond? Top 7. The Cahokia Collapse. From the Mediterranean at the edge of recorded history, we cross the Atlantic to a city that most people have never heard of, one that was larger than medieval London, and that disappeared without leaving a single written word about why: the Cahokia Collapse. At its peak, Cahokia was larger than London, with 20,000 people living there. Its central earthwork, Monk's Mound, contained more earth than any structure built in North America before or after it for centuries. Its trading network stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. Then, sometime after 1150 AD, it began to die. By 1400, it was empty. No European had arrived, no foreign army had attacked, and no written record exists of what happened. When archaeologists finally began to find the answer, it was in the sediment at the bottom of a lake. Cahokia has been under excavation since the 1960s, but the epidemic hypothesis gained specific archaeological support through a 2015 study led by A.J. White, published in American Antiquity, which analyzed sediment cores from Horseshoe Lake, Cahokia's primary water source. The cores revealed a catastrophic flood deposit dated to around 1150 AD, consistent with Mississippi River flooding that would have contaminated the city's freshwater supply with fecal matter and waterborne pathogens. Physical anthropologist Jerome Rose and colleagues at the University of Arkansas conducted skeletal analysis of Cahokia's cemetery populations and identified stress markers consistent with epidemic disease. A city of 20,000 people, sophisticated enough to build Monk's Mound, a structure whose base covers 14 acres, was completely abandoned within approximately 250 years. No conqueror's record survives, and no oral tradition from the city itself has been preserved. The skeletal record shows stress markers in both worker and elite populations consistent with nutritional collapse and infectious disease, but no specific pathogen has ever been identified. Monk's Mound was built in multiple construction phases between approximately 900 and 1200 AD, requiring the organized labor of tens of thousands over multiple generations. A.J. White's 2015 study identified a massive flood deposit in Horseshoe Lake sediment cores dated to around 1150 AD, consistent with catastrophic flooding that overwhelmed Cahokia's freshwater infrastructure and created ideal conditions for waterborne disease transmission. Jerome Rose's skeletal analysis found elevated rates of enamel hypoplasia, a marker of childhood nutritional stress and infectious disease, interrupting dental development in individuals dated to the post-1150 population decline phase. Isotopic analysis of Cahokia skeletal remains indicates the population drew heavily from distant regions, meaning Cahokia had no stable local immune population and was acutely vulnerable to any pathogen introduced by new arrivals. The broader Mississippian cultural network declined across its entire geographic range in the same period, suggesting a regional crisis. The population appears to have declined in two distinct phases: a sharp initial drop after 1150 coinciding with the flood event, and a final abandonment around 1350 to 1400 consistent with a second epidemic cycle. Unlike every other major ancient collapse site, Cahokia left no written records and no surviving oral tradition, making it one of the most complete civilizational silences in the archaeological record. Archaeologists generally favor a multi-causal collapse model involving environmental stress from flooding and deforestation, but the flood of 1150 created the precise conditions for a waterborne epidemic to move through the city with catastrophic speed. The skeletal stress markers documented by Jerome Rose are not the signature of slow decline. They are the demographic footprint of mass mortality in a compressed period. Could Cahokia be the earliest evidence in North America of urbanization as an epidemic risk multiplier? The silence at the bottom of Horseshoe Lake has not yet been made to speak. Top 8. The Mystery Epidemic at Amarna. From a city that left no written record of its end, we cross to a city whose written records were deliberately destroyed and where the skeletal evidence of epidemic death has been waiting in the sand for 3,000 years. The Mystery Epidemic at Amarna. Akhenaten built the most radical city in Egyptian history in 17 years. He abolished every god in the Egyptian pantheon, declared the sun disk the only true deity, moved the entire capital to a blank stretch of desert, and forced a civilization 3,000 years old to follow him into the experiment. Within a generation, his city was dead. His name was chiseled from every monument in Egypt, and his successors acted as if he had never existed. What happened at Amarna was not merely political. The bones in the sand suggest it was also biological. The Amarna Project, led by archaeologist Barry Kemp of Cambridge University, has excavated the site continuously since 1977. In 2006, Kemp's team's analysis of the South Tomb Cemetery, A worker's graveyard containing over 3,000 individuals revealed skeletal evidence of extreme physical stress and infection markers consistent with epidemic conditions. In 2010, a joint study by the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities and the Freiburg University Institute, using CT scanning and ancient DNA analysis of Tutankhamun's remains and associated royal mummies, identified Plasmodium falciparum, the most lethal malaria strain, in multiple members of the royal family. The royal family of Amarna was effectively extinguished within 20 years. Akhenaten died young, his co-regent Smenkhare died young, his daughter Meritiden died young, and Tutankhamun, his probable son, died at approximately 18 years of age with skeletal evidence of multiple concurrent serious infections. Across the Nile in the workers' cemetery, approximately 70% of the population showed evidence of significant physical stress and infectious disease, a rate far exceeding comparable Egyptian cemeteries from other sites and periods. An entire royal dynasty and a workforce of thousands appear to have been dying from the same environmental exposure simultaneously. Barry Kemp's skeletal analysis found that approximately 70% of individuals in the South Tomb Cemetery showed evidence of significant physical trauma and nutritional stress. Tutankhamun's CT analysis revealed a cleft palate, clubfoot, and bone necrosis in his left foot, conditions consistent with immune compromise caused by epidemic co-infection, severe inbreeding, or both. Hittite royal archives at Hattusa contain explicit records of an epidemic arriving from Egypt during the Amarna period carried by Egyptian envoys that killed the Hittite king Suppiluliuma and his crown prince, with the Hittite records explicitly naming Akhenaten's court as the source. The Amarna letters, the diplomatic correspondence archive excavated from the site, contain desperate appeals from Egyptian vassal states in Canaan and Syria, describing military attacks and requesting help that never arrived, suggesting Egyptian military capacity had been severely compromised. Akhenaten chose Amarna's location based on a religious vision, selecting a stretch of the Nile bank specifically avoided by previous Egyptian settlement, possibly placing the city in a zone of exceptional mosquito density and Plasmodium falciparum exposure that established sites had learned through centuries of experience to leave uninhabited. Egyptologists generally attribute the collapse to political and religious backlash, but the Hittite records are first-hand documentation explicitly identifying Egyptian envoys as the source of an epidemic that killed two Hittite rulers. Could one pharaoh's religious vision have accidentally created an incubation environment that killed his entire dynasty and exported the resulting pathogen to foreign courts? Could Amarna's mystery be a question of mosquito ecology? Top 9. The Han Dynasty Epidemic. From Egypt's doomed experiments in the desert, we travel east along the Silk Road to the other end of the ancient world, where at the precise moment Rome was dying of the Antonine Plague, the greatest empire in Asia was dying of something remarkably similar, the Han Dynasty Epidemic. At the exact moment the Antonine Plague was killing 5 million people in the Roman Empire, something was happening in the Yellow River Basin of China. The Han Dynasty, Rome's equal in population, wealth, and military power, was being destroyed by an epidemic with the same timing, the same symptom profile, and the same political consequences. Two physicians writing in different languages on opposite sides of the known world were documenting what may have been the same disease. Neither of them knew the other existed. Chinese primary sources for this epidemic include the Book of the Later Han and the medical texts of Zhang Zhongjing, known as the medical sage, who wrote the treatise on cold damage disorders, still one of the foundational texts of traditional Chinese medicine, in direct response to the epidemic he personally witnessed. Zhang's preface to the treatise contains a first-hand account of epidemic mortality that is one of the most striking personal documents in ancient medical history. Modern scholarly analysis of the Roman Han epidemic connection was substantially advanced by Kyle Harper and by historian Valerie Hansen's work on Silk Road transmission dynamics. Zhang Zhongjing wrote in the preface to his treatise that his own clan of 200 people lost 70% of its members in less than 10 years, and that 2/3 of those deaths shared the same symptom pattern. He describes high fever, pustular skin eruptions, and fatal respiratory complications, a presentation clinically compatible with smallpox and consistent with what Galen was simultaneously documenting in Rome. The Silk Road had connected the two greatest empires on Earth into a single epidemiological system. Chinese historical records document epidemic waves in 161, 171, 173, 179, 182, and 185 AD, a pattern of recurring outbreaks strikingly parallel to the documented recurrence pattern of the Roman Antonine Plague in precisely the same years. Han Dynasty census records document a population of approximately 56 million in the second year AD that had fallen to approximately 16 million by 280 AD, a collapse of more than 70% over 3 centuries, with the epidemic period of 161 to 220 AD identified as the sharpest single phase of decline. The Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 AD, which fatally fractured the Han Dynasty's political unity, was directly linked by Chinese historians to the epidemic's destruction of agricultural labor capacity. Valerie Hansen's analysis demonstrates that Chinese and Roman luxury goods were regularly exchanged through Central Asian intermediaries, creating a corridor along which variola major could have traveled. A 2022 archaeomic study of Central Asian Silk Road populations identified genetic markers of historical smallpox exposure in populations along the precise route serving as the transmission corridor. The identical timing across 6,000 hours cannot be explained by independent parallel evolution. The fall of Rome and the fragmentation of the Han Dynasty were not separate historical events. They were the Eastern and Western expressions of a single biological catastrophe. Top 10. The Plague of Shiro. If the Silk Road connected Rome and China into a single epidemic system, consider what it meant for the civilization at the center of that road. The empire, whose sudden collapse in a single season of epidemic death opened the door for a new world to begin, the Plague of Shiro. In the year 627 AD, the Sasanian Persian Empire was the most powerful state on earth. It had just defeated Byzantium, occupied Jerusalem, captured the True Cross, and extended its territory to the gates of Constantinople. Its armies had not lost a major campaign in a generation. Then an epidemic arrived in the royal capital of Ctesiphon. Within 18 months, the emperor was dead, his successor was dead, and the royal court had been effectively wiped out. 9 years later, Arab armies swept through what remained. The disease did not just kill an emperor, it may have determined which civilization would shape the next 14 centuries of human history. The epidemic is documented in the Arabic language, Chronicle of Sirt, the Syriac Chronicle of Khuzestan, and by the Byzantine historian Theophanes. Modern scholarly analysis of the epidemic's political consequences was developed significantly by historian Turaj Daryai in his 2009 work, Sasanian Persia, The Rise and Fall of an Empire. The Sasanian Empire had survived 5 centuries of warfare, yet something reduced it from the world's dominant military power in 627 AD to a state unable to organize coherent resistance by 636 AD, a collapse of institutional capacity in under a decade. The Chronicle of Sayert documents the epidemic killing Emperor Kavad II and most of the nobility and military commanders assembled at Ctesiphon. What followed was at least 8 different rulers in 4 years, not a political crisis, but a biological decapitation of an entire civilization's leadership class. King Khosrow II, who had brought the empire to its greatest territorial extent, was overthrown by his son, Kavad II, in 628 AD, but Kavad II himself died within months, with the Chronicle of Sayert explicitly attributing his death to a waba, a pestilence. The epidemic appears in Byzantine sources as well. Theophanes records that Persian forces in the field were devastated by disease during their military withdrawal. Arab historian al-Tabari describes the Sasanian state at the moment of the Arab invasion as essentially pre-collapsed, with the treasury empty and the army disorganized. Contemporary Syriac Christian sources describe mass burials across Mesopotamia in 627 and 628 AD, with entire villages depopulated. This timing placed the epidemic in a population whose immune and physical resilience had already been catastrophically compromised by 26 years of war. Military exhaustion does not produce 8 rulers in 4 years. Financial stress does not kill the emperor, his heir, and the assembled military command simultaneously. The Plague of Shiro represents one of history's most consequential examples of epidemic disease as a geopolitical catalyst. If the Sasanian ruling class had not been wiped out in 628 AD, would the Arab armies have encountered organized imperial resistance? Could the religious and political geography of the modern Middle East trace its deepest origin to an unidentified pathogen that arrived in Ctesiphon in the autumn of 627 AD? 10 civilizations, 10 epidemics, some named, some still unidentified. The same pattern appears in every case. The epidemic arrives at the moment of maximum civilizational complexity, when trade routes are fullest and grain ships are most active. The very infrastructure that made these societies great was the mechanism through which the pathogen moved. Historians may call these collapses inevitable, but the bones in those burial pits were specific people who felt a specific fever on a specific morning. They came on grain ships and along trade routes, leaving no monuments but ending civilizations that had taken centuries to build. In the summer of 1545 in central Mexico, someone felt a fever and a burning behind the eyes. 5 centuries later, we found their teeth in the ground. The DNA was still there. The dead do not disappear. If these stories of invisible killers have changed how you view the rise and fall of empires, please subscribe and like this video. We are unearthing the history that they tried to bury. Help us grow the future of discovery. The next treasury of secrets will be opened soon.